I was forced to cook at my husband's promotion party, so I served the catering company he built with my money. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I am 58 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own greed, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get the karma they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to... I met Robert when we were both 25. He had the kind of laugh that made a room tilt toward him, and the kind of ideas that always needed a little cash to get started. When his startup sputtered in year 2, he asked for help. I just need seed money," he said while balancing 2 coffee cups on his knee. I signed a check from a small inheritance left by my mother, money I had imagined would buy a quieter life. He put the funds into something called Maple Lane Holdings. The papers were in his briefcase. I trusted his signature like I trusted his hand at mine. After that check, one small change led to another. I learned to do invoices by late-night fluorescent light because he was on the road. I became expert at packaging meals when he'd invite out-of-town clients to the house, and I understood the cadence of expense reports even though my name rarely appeared. When cash flow tightened, I moved funds between accounts to cover payroll so no one would be left short the week before Christmas. People thanked him in public. I handled the private consequences. Until it was normalized into expectation. Then came the quiet disrespect that accumulates like dust. At networking dinners, he introduced me as Eleanor. She keeps things afloat at home. The phrase carried the sweetness of a compliment wrapped in dismissal. I kept my mouth small, polished my smile, and let it be. When a vendor once asked me to just help with canapes, I did it, because I'd been doing what needed doing for so long that saying no felt like breaking a rib. Over the years, my tasks multiplied. Signatures on loan guarantees, emergency transfers overnight, personally guaranteeing a line of credit after the banker looked at me and asked if there was someone more permanent. I thought permanence had a face. I was wrong. A subtle shift happened when Robert's office began to license software, modules that regional companies could modify. He wanted those assets under a single umbrella. "It protects the IP," he told me, pointing at the filings. My signature went on again. Maple Lane became the holding company for the software, the rental agreements, the patents. In the boardroom, they praised his foresight. In the kitchen, I adjusted to being the one who paid the costs when the payroll file bounced. It was invisible labor with ledger entries I rarely checked. When the firm started hosting bigger events, my role shrank to the margins. I was the woman who ironed his shirts and baked the lasagna people remembered. He thanked staff in speeches and used "we" in interviews. It warmed me until applause died down and somebody asked me for a favor. Could I serve? Could I step in? I told myself it was tradition. I told myself I didn't mind. Each time I said yes, I handed a little more control over the narrative to someone who delighted in taking credit. One day, I noticed a younger woman at the office, Chloe, who laughed too loud at the right moments and wore more makeup than the job required. She called Robert boss and touched his arm in ways friends don't. They seemed delighted with each other. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I kept naming worry, because a woman who had been practical her whole life needed a name she could manage. I brushed it aside with dinner plans and spreadsheets. By the time the invitation for his promotion gala came, calling me help with the lasagna instead of join me, I was standing in a familiar place, being asked to give the labor without claiming the dignity. Outside, the city hum magnified, new clients, new office space, and a veneer of success. Inside, Maple Lane's documents sat in a drawer with my mother's recipe cards. The holding company facade meant everything on paper and nothing in the house. I learned to speak softly about money because loud talk made people uncomfortable. I learned to set plates and set aside questions. Each small sacrifice felt like love until the ledger taught me how little was theirs to applaud. On the morning of his promotion gala, the caterer canceled. It was described to me as an emergency, a double booking, a truck with engine trouble, something inconvenient and solvable. Robert's voice on the phone next to the microwave sounded casual. "E," he said, "would you mind stepping in with your lasagna? They'll love it." He sounded as if he were asking a neighbor to water a plant. Behind him, I heard laughter, Chloe's laugh, bright and unbothered. For a second, I pictured declining. I pictured walking away and not signing the next check. Then I smoothed my dress and tied an apron. Walking into that ballroom with an aluminum pan in my hands felt wrong in a way that wasn't loud. Men rose slightly when they recognized the dish and clapped heretofore at memories rather than at me. Chloe walked through the room in a satin dress, her hand resting on Robert's elbow in a manner the cameras interpreted as a family photo. He posed like someone whose world had tilted in the direction he'd always wanted. I moved through tables, handing out portions, and his colleagues thanked me like I was a charming piece of the evening's decor. At the podium, Robert's speech glittered. He talked about vision and leadership and the people who supported him. Someone raised a glass. The photographer called for the group shot. Chloe slipped into the place that, in other years, might have been mine. I stood at the periphery with a tray and the skill of a woman who had learned to hold herself steady. No dramatic argument, no public humiliation. I watched and poured wine. After the event, with chairs stacked and the city night cool against my cheeks, Robert found me near the service door. He had a drink in his hand and Chloe at his side, and he said, "You did a great job tonight." The tone had the practiced flippancy of a man who believed compliments replaced obligations. "This promotion means a lot," he added. "We can finally stop worrying." He kissed Chloe's temple and then mine, the gesture as precise as a stamp. That night, I ironed the napkins with my hands shaking, but my voice light when I called to ask about bank statements. A few days later, I opened a letter from the corporate bank addressed to Maple Lane Holdings, an innocuous update about signature authorities. The envelope held news that felt small like a pinprick. Chloe had been added as an authorized signatory to a company card as an assistant. When I asked Robert about it over coffee, he said with a casual shrug, "She helps with outreach. It's convenient." The word convenient sat like a rock. I didn't raise my voice. I folded towels and asked a question. "Is she on any legal documents?" He smiled and deflected. At a monthly board lunch, partners spoke of fresh perspectives. They nodded at Robert and at Chloe in ways that made my presence invisible. One of them, Tom, mentioned how modern branding didn't pair well with a spouse doing unpaid work at events. The comment landed exactly where it should, as an instruction rather than observation. It was then that I felt the weight of being an undiscussed contingency. They were remodeling the company in a way that removed my name from its walls. The breaking point came one thin Tuesday that smelled of rain. Robert called me into his office and said, The board thinks it's best if you step back from attending company events for a while. He used the voice of concern, the same voice that had once soothed a child. It undermines our image. You understand, don't you? Chloe hovered like a bookmark in his sentences. The sentence wasn't phrased as a conversation. It was a directive. The world narrowed into the kitchen light. My hands made tea without trembling. At that moment, the story shifted from erosion to decision. Before I could storm or plead, I received a soft, professional envelope from Mr. Weller, my attorney, reminding me of the clause in the original agreement that allowed the controlling member to petition a dissolution under certain conditions. The legal language felt like a cool hand. I read it 3 times in the quiet of the laundry room. The clause had been inked at a time when trust still felt like a mutual currency. It read as an instrument, not a weapon. I made a small, precise plan: to use what the paper allowed without making noise. Not vengeance, just consequence. The next morning, I walked through the house slowly, taking photos with my phone of the frames, the well-worn armchair, the recipe binder where my mother's handwriting leaned into my life. Each picture felt like a ledger entry, evidence of the life I had underwritten. Then I opened the Maple Lane folder and read the operating agreement with the attention I'd once reserved for my grandchildren's report cards. My initials were there, tied to language that named me a managing member in the event of changes to corporate control. The law was not emotional. It was mechanical, a machine I could operate. I called Mr. Weller and asked him to come. He arrived with a calm that belonged to men who handle wills and quiet closures. Over tea, he explained what I already knew in clearer terms. The dissolution clause, if executed properly, would place Maple Lane into distribution and require the reallocation of assets, which would remove the legal foundation for certain lines of credit and licensing agreements. It would not be immediate theatrical ruin, he said. It would be legal disentanglement. I placed a pen on the paper and signed. Signing felt simple and vast at once. It was not a cry. It was paperwork and intent. Then I took practical steps. I called the bank to notify them of upcoming changes. I halted automatic transfers that routed household funds into corporate accounts. And I changed password recoveries so statements would be rerouted to my attorney's office. Each action was precise, like a surgeon closing a seam. I left notes for our children, a few sentences explaining that I wasn't leaving them without means, only without being the silent funder of choices that had made me invisible. That afternoon, I packed a small overnight bag. 2 dresses, my mother's recipe binder, a watch Robert had given me years ago, and a sealed envelope with copies of wills for the grandchildren. I didn't slam doors. I closed them with a softness that felt intentional. I left through the service door at dusk and handed Mr. Weller the authority to file dissolution papers with the Secretary of State. For the first time in a long time, I slept without thinking of checks I needed to write. Within a day, notices started arriving at the firm's office, clerks and courier envelopes that spelled out consequences in bureaucratic language. One vendor asked why the guaranteed payment line was showing a freeze. An HR manager called to say payroll had a hiccup. I received messages from old friends who were also stakeholders, their voices threaded with panic and surprise. When Robert called, his tone was tightly controlled. "Eleanor, what did you do?" He sounded less like a leader and more like someone who'd misplaced a tool. As the legal wheels turned, so did the partners' relationships. One of them, David, who had always been kindly to me in passing, sent me a hesitant message asking if I'd consider consulting to help with employee transitions. In my reply, I offered a different kind of help, a funded transition program overseen by the trust, not a cash infusion back into a company that had turned my generosity into an assumption. It was a compromise that kept the dignity of people I cared about without patching the holes left by poor choices. On the fourth day, the notice of dissolution hit the Secretary of State's database. The filing was administrative, not theatrical, but it triggered the technical clauses in leases and licensing agreements. One of the regional licensees sent a formal notice pausing royalty payments until the corporate structure was clarified. A lender flagged the accounts for further review. The scaffolding that had held the firm's outward confidence began to creak. I watched from a distance, not with malice, but with a strange, clear grief. Consequences finally answering for choices. That night, I sat on a motel balcony with my mother's recipe binder on my knees. The city lights trembled below. I thought about the years of doing small things, calls at midnight, counts that saved cycles of bankruptcy, thinking it was love. The thought that stung most was this: I had loved a version of the man I helped create. He had loved he version he built. Somewhere between those rooms, a woman in an apron became someone's help rather than his partner. The decision to stop underwriting that life felt less like victory and more like an adult removing a child's training wheels. Before dawn, a new event rattled the firm's doors. An internal memo, leaked anonymously, suggesting irregular vendor payments. The memo hinted at invoices routed through third-party accounts. It named little things and small weirdnesses. Partners gathered in emergency calls, voices thick with defensive strategies. Robert, who once commanded rooms, now found them looking at their watches. The company needed him to be steady. He found himself increasingly unmoored. I did not race to the courthouse. I did not shout. I moved through a sequence of cold, practical actions, a withdrawal of financial support, rerouted statements, the filing of dissolution. The actions were quiet but automatic, like turning off a faucet. Each click in the sequence had legal weight. Each triggered consequence moved like a line item in the accounts. Consequences arrived in modest, bureaucratic waves that aggregated into a storm. The bank called, and then called again, voice clipped, asking for verification that Maple Lane still had control over collateral. When confirmation couldn't be provided because the holding company had been placed into dissolution, the bank froze the lines pending legal review. Cash flow hiccuped into halted transfers. Vendors who once trusted the firm began to insist on upfront payments. Within 48 hours, partners started sending terse messages. David, who had been steady, texted, "We need a meeting, now." The meeting turned into accusatory exchanges where each partner tried to distance themselves from prior decisions. Tom tried to lay blame on an accounting oversight. Another partner floated the idea of emergency loans that required guarantees none of them had appetite for now. The cohesion that had held the firm in public dissolved under pressure. A new event, the landlord's letter, complicated things further. The lease had been guaranteed by the holding company. Without it, the landlord served notice demanding immediate renegotiation of terms, including a significant security deposit. Office staff began to whisper about layoffs. Payroll, which had been smooth for years, hesitated at the lip of the processing window. I heard the HR managers panic in clipped voicemails. "We don't have answers for people, Eleanor." Her voice broke in a way that pushed through my armor. I redirected the trust to cover a short-term employee relief fund rather than patching a failing corporate account. At the same time, investors who had been promise-bound stepped back. A venture group that had scheduled a term sheet withdrew when their legal counsel flagged the Secretary of State filing. We can't proceed with that level of corporate ambiguity, their representative said. Contracts with regional licensees that tied royalties to Maple Lane's continued existence were put on hold. The steady revenue stream that had paid salaries and marketing evaporated into legal ambiguity. One unexpected twist occurred when someone leaked direct evidence of misallocated vendor invoices. A former bookkeeper, resentful and done, uploaded documents showing payments that grazed personal accounts. The memo named dates and amounts and provided bank routing numbers. It didn't point a theatrical finger, it showed patterns. Within hours, the boardroom that had toasted champagne at product launches held a meeting none of them wanted, an ethical accounting of what had happened. Partners who had once raised toasts now considered counsel and containment. Chloe's exit was quieter than gossip predicted. She packed a suitcase and left in the middle of the night, a mutual acquaintance later told me, saying she wanted to get away from the mess. She phoned never again. The rumor mill chewed and spat a few rumors. She left with a payoff, or she knew this was coming, none of which mattered to the slow arithmetic of corporate collapse. Her absence, like everything else, was a practical subtraction. Within a week, a small group of licensees filed for an injunction, arguing that because the holding company had been dissolved, the asset transfers needed legal oversight. The injunction froze licensing revenue, which meant the firm could not sustain ongoing operations. The partners scrambled for legal remedies that were more prayers than plans. The PR firm, sensing a meltdown, suggested controlled releases. The legal firm recommended distance. Investors who had once celebrated asset potential now ran numbers with red lines and contingency plans. The company that had once seemed to orbit Robert collapsed into conference calls with tight, harsh agendas. I watched the fallout the way one watches weather on a radar, impersonal but unavoidable. I received messages from men and women I'd once counted as friends, some pleading, some accusatory. Robert's calls came at odd hours. His voice went thin and then brittle. "Eleanor, they won't work with me," he'd say. "They think we engineered this." He meant me. In truth, I had done what the paperwork allowed and what my dignity required. I watched him experience the natural consequences of choices he had made in 1,000 careless moments. One final twist happened mid-morning, when a small local reporter asked for quotes by partners days before, published an investigative piece noting the Secretary of State filing, the frozen accounts, and the appearance of irregular invoices. The tone wasn't vindictive, it was business reporting. The firm's clientele began asking questions. The partners began to carve polite distance. The legal cascade had become public. The man who had once taken applause found himself standing before questions with his name attached to liabilities he hadn't counted. I did not attend the meetings where they assigned blame. I didn't need to. Contracts and legal processes did the work I had quietly set in motion. I sat with my tea and my recipe book and let consequence do its quiet, impartial arithmetic. Robert came to the house on a gray Tuesday with a small cardboard box, old letters, mismatched cufflinks, a watch that had stopped because nobody wound it. He stood on the porch and asked, in a voice that had lost the flippant ease of applause, "Eleanor, can we talk? For the kids?" He sounded smaller, years removed from the man who once filled rooms. I made tea and poured 2 cups. He sat as if expecting absolution to be a chair I would offer. He asked for my help, not for money, but for signatures, introductions, the social smoothing only I could do. He used nostalgia and named grandchildren and small domestic memories like currency. He said, "I made mistakes." He asked for a role that would once again make me the person who would patch and promise. I listened and then calmly said no. I explained that the trust would fund a transition program for employees and that my personal involvement as a signatory was over. I didn't speak angry words. I didn't wave documents. I set a boundary as if setting the table, with intention and without fanfare. In the weeks that followed, people came, friends who wanted to reconcile and partners who wanted to negotiate. Some asked if I would return the name to the stationery if they promised reform. Others came with small apologies that didn't ask for change. I made a decision about each overture the way I had made all others, measured, practical, and final. I offered help where it mattered, employee transition funds, donating the arrangement of flowers Robert had sent to hospice care, but not as a lifeline to make them whole again. Then life, which had been compressed around obligations and explanations, opened like a window. I took the cruise I'd paid for months earlier, a simple cabin, a balcony, a good book. I listened to sea and felt the world stretch without the expectation of constant repair. I planted tomatoes in the backyard and watched green shoots push through the soil. I went to my granddaughter's violin recital and didn't answer a single work email afterward. Ordinary things filled me. The hum of the kettle, the way sunlight hits the recipe binder at the table, the soft weight of a neighbor's hand when she squeezed my arm in passing. In one small event that meant everything, Robert called and asked if he could bring our oldest grandson by for lunch. I said yes. He arrived with a sandwich and an awkwardness. We ate at the kitchen table. He watched his son and told stories that were self-aware and small. For the first time in years, I saw him as someone reduced to the ordinary, a man who had to earn respect in daily, humble ways. I didn't rub his nose in consequence. I let him have a place at the table without handing him the estate. Chloe never returned. The firm reorganized, with some partners salvaging pieces and others leaving the industry. People I had known professionally found new work. Some paid reputational prices that couldn't be undone by excuses. I did not celebrate their pain. I tended my garden and my grandchildren and my peace. The revenge, if you call it that, was a simple set of boundaries that allowed natural consequences to distribute themselves. On a late afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and my recipe binder open on my knees. The sun lay warm on the tomatoes. A neighbor waved and stopped to chat about a new recipe. I told her about a lemon glaze my mother used to make, and for a moment I was simply a woman sharing a story. That ordinary exchange felt like a repair you could live inside. I had not shouted or staged a spectacle. I had closed a door with a key the law allowed me to use, and with a dignity I'd stopped choosing to give away. If you ask me now what I'd advise another woman in my place, I say this: document, know your papers, and protect your dignity. Hold the line gently, but without apology. You don't have to dramatize justice. You can let contracts and boundaries do their work. The quiet recovery, the reclaimed inheritance, the small breakfasts with grandchildren, the slow healing in everyday life is the most persuasive outcome. I am not a hero in a movie. I'm a woman who loved, who gave, and who finally chose herself. I make my coffee on the porch every morning and taste freedom in small sips. When I see Robert's name in the news, it doesn't burn me. It simply reminds me that consequence is not loud. It is steady, like soil making room for new roots.